Hi, I'm Ben Carr, and today we have in the seat Ron Gula, luminary in cyber, a long-time participant, and yeah, I've actually worked for Ron in the past, so great to have you in the studio, Ron.
Ben, great to see you again. How's it going?
Good, really, really good. For those of you out there who aren't familiar with you, can you maybe give like a kind of synopsis, brief description of kind of what you're doing now and kind of where you came from?
Thanks. So, Ron Gula, I am the president of Gula Tech Adventures. I've been in the industry long enough to have the gray hair and all the good stuff.
Yeah, it's hitting everybody now.
That's right. That's right. So, started out in the Air Force.
Okay.
Didn't do well enough at fighter pilot school that I did my first love, which was basically computers. Got into the National Security Agency right around the time they were doing information security, information warfare. Nobody called it cyber back then. This was the mid-90s.
Okay.
But I got to be at the center of some really cool national exercises, that sort of thing. Basically set me up to have a career in cyber. So from there, I got to do some Beltway Bandit stuff, worked with BBN, worked with honeypots, that kind of stuff.
Nice.
And then I got to work with one of the first cloud companies called US Internetworking. While there, I was working with ISS, great company at the time, but I wanted to do something better. So my wife and I started Network Security Wizards, did the Dragon IDS. That company got acquired by Interisys. And then the people who acquired us, we all started Tenable Network Security. And after doing that for just under 20 years, really more like 16 years or so, we started Gula Tech Adventures, and we invest, do cyber philanthropy, and try to educate the public about cybersecurity.
Yeah, and you really do a lot with cyber philanthropy, so I don't want to like downplay that at all. I mean, I think that's one of the great things that you and Cindy have really contributed back to the industry. So yeah, thank you for that.
I definitely appreciate that, and we definitely think, look, you need more tech, right? We need more people, and we need good policy, and there's a combination of like venture capital, educating the policymakers, and then trying to inspire the people in the nonprofit side to treat this as like, look, we could be facing World War III any day now. What we do in cyber is very, very important.
Yeah, I think we don't focus on it enough on the policy side, really. That's an area we always focus on tech. Like tech's kind of number one. And I think, unfortunately, that's kind of the last in the tree for me, right? Like people really are foundationally where a lot of this comes from and where a lot of the problem comes from, right? But then on the policy side, I think it's helping inform that policy and educating people who are actually making policy, because a lot of times they're not really well educated in this space. And so I don't know, maybe you have any thoughts on from a policy side? And
It's very interesting. So we've talked to everybody, people who are running for office to people who are in office, and we start talking about cybersecurity and cyber, and what is cyber, right? Is cyber a computer? Is cyber the data on the computer? Is cyber, the hackers in the hoodies and that kind of stuff? And it's so hard for the general public to relate, let alone a policy person to relate. One of the concepts we came up with, and this is my wife Cindy's idea, is we want to call this industry data care, and instantly makes cybersecurity relatable to people who deal with healthcare. And you think about healthcare, we have the brain surgeons, we have people who fill our prescriptions at CVS, we have our doctors, and we have our own personal wellness. And we want to have that same thing in cybersecurity. And a lot of times people just, we almost go out of our way in this industry to be like, it's not the end user's fault, right? We can't rely on them. And I kind of really think we do need to make them part of this problem, right? And part of the solution of trying to protect the data that they have and have this personal responsibility for what they want to protect.
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's really typical of people to assume that it is a technological problem, right? But at the end of it, if people aren't concerned about their data, if they're not concerned about where that data is going, how it's being used, then I think the people that are making policy decisions aren't really going to care either. And that's a frustrating disconnect when I think, look, if you have a data breach of your credit card information and you call that company and you say, hey, look, I'd like to understand how that data was used, and I'd like to understand where that leak came from, you'll quickly find out that you won't get any information. And that's really, really frustrating. Like, I think there should be a duty of care for somebody to say, hey, your data was used at X location. They didn't take a care to that. You now have the option of making that informed consumer decision not to interact with that vendor, right? But that just doesn't happen. And I think that's one instance. All right, you're nodding your head, so I'm guessing you agree.
I definitely agree. But the issue is that we've just thrown so many things into this term cybersecurity.
Yeah.
So you hit a couple different things, like consumer confidence, care of data. Are we going to be buying devices that have security labels on them? Like, there's so many things going on. And that's been a disservice of our industry. Everything's cyber. When everything's cyber, nothing's cyber, right? So we want to call it data care, focus on that. And I'd love to see things like, when you're at a store, we obviously know things are made in China, but like you have a security label that says data stored in China, you dramatically change consumer confidence in what they're buying. And those are the kind of things we want to give those little nuggets to the policymakers when they're talking about this.
Yeah, I think you see a little bit of that come up, right? There's been a lot of concern with TikTok recently, right? Because of the concerns about the data and the usage in China. But yeah, it isn't really evident to the average consumer of where their data is actually being stored and how it's being used.
And the funny thing about the TikTok is their architecture for how they want to keep the data in America. It's actually a pretty good architecture. This whole Project Texas, they're going to use NSA-style guards to keep the data in here, really have control over who can see it, that kind of stuff. Oracle's helping them do it. Oracle's a great U.S. company, that kind of thing. I would love to see that kind of transparency at Google, at DigitalOcean, all these other kind of big companies like that, and Facebook and whatnot. I think that'd be really interesting to kind of set that as the norm.
Yeah, what do you feel about making it more easy for the consumer to actually understand, right? So when you sign up for a new product, a new service, you sign the agreement, and the agreement is 85 pages, it's legalese, and you really have no idea what you're actually signing up for, but you want to use the service, so you just sign it. Like, in my opinion, I just don't even see the point of signing, of having the doc, because like no one actually understands it and consumes it, so it's not really informed consent. But they're relying on the legal framework to say that they've given you all the information, when even in that data, even in that information, they haven't really thoroughly explained it.
So I think the way I talk about this is when, and I'm not an Ed Snowden fan, but Ed Snowden did a great job talking about what the NSA could look at with the data they collected. And change NSA to Facebook, change NSA to Evernote, change NSA to Dropbox. What can people do with the data you have? And you don't have to read an end user license agreement. You can basically just ask ChatGPT and say, okay, according to the end user license agreement of TikTok, what can they do with my image? And a lot of people don't realize that they have the power to kind of, these guys can read my notes.
Yeah, I would have never thought to use ChatGPT for that. So
we've actually been pitched companies who, because one of the issues is, okay, you read the EULA, the end user license agreement today, and you're good with it. You're like, okay, however they're doing it, I'm okay with them. I'm willing to work with them as a vendor. But then a year later, they change, right? So there's companies that have pitched us just doing change management on changes in end user license agreement. I just did a video about this on our podcast talking about secure by design. How can you actually understand if a company is doing secure by design? Because if they do a really, really good job, they're not really going to tell you. You have to kind of read between the lines of their end user license agreement. Maybe you have to get under NDA and that sort of things. But usually small, subtle changes into phrasings of what they do with the data or the metadata that they're collecting are really strong indicators of what they're mining and what they're using to sell to other people. We're the products in a lot of these other companies.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that people don't realize a lot of times, that you are actually the product, right? Yeah. I think that's come out a little bit more, but I think it's generally still not well known, especially from youth, right? I think they think that they can just consume this stuff without the concern for how it's going to be used. If they are the product, what's being done with it. Yeah.
So we were talking about policy. Another thing I like to kind of remind people about is, so far, as far as the history of what we've done, you go back to Obama and you had some really good progress on a variety of different laws, and probably the first use of offensive cyber, perhaps, right? Trump, we actually started banning bad companies, Huawei, DJI, that kind of thing. So the Biden administration, we've got our first, Office of the National Cybersecurity Director, a whole variety of the national cybersecurity, so the cyberspace solarium, being implemented. Is a lot of really good movement. And so we're sort of like the best we've ever been, but we still have this long way to go, which is why I'm always talking about reminding the general public about, look, it's all about your data. You have to be part of this solution and whatnot. But there's been tremendous progress over the last 6 years or so.
So when you bring up policy, I maybe pivot back just a personal interest, right? When we think about the ransomware problem and how that's actually being, I guess, magnified right now. Change Healthcare certainly hit. I think the recent stats that I've seen, most recent, is 1 in 3 users in the United States have been somehow impacted by Change Healthcare. $1.6 billion impact for Change. That really raises the bar. And I guess the question comes out from a policy side. Where do you stand on making payments to ransomware illegal, right? Because for me, it really seems that the motivation is a monetary motivation, right? Historically, I don't think that's necessarily been the case. There's a lot of other reasons for the motivation, whether it be state actors, whether it be script kiddies, whether it just be general malicious behavior. But now it's changed to this monetary concept. And so with that, I don't think we're really ever going to see meaningful impact unless we do something. But I know that that's a really politically charged discussion for a lot of people in cyber. And I'm just wondering where you come out on that. Do you think that's...
a lot of people put the focus on in the moment, right? You've been ransomwared. What should you do? And a lot of people want to pass judgment on that. Oh, if you pay the ransomware, you're going to fund the war in Russia. I don't know if that's really true, right? Or, if you don't pay the ransomware, you're a horrible business person because you're spending more money on fixing things, right? I wish the focus was more on preventing, right? It's not like these ransomware attacks aren't preventable. Great products out there like Halcyon.
Thanks.
But there's also great solutions like just cyber hygiene, like patch your stuff, right? Like understand what your assets are, right?
Tenable, right? Like
exactly,
we go back such a long time. Like I think, the core of it even before that, like on the IT side, just the assets, like understanding what your assets are. And then, as you mentioned, fixing the hygiene, like fixing the problem, right? That's been a deficiency for a long, long time.
And to me, this question of like, should you pay or shouldn't you pay ransomware is a lack of professionalization of our industry. And I think we need to talk to small business and large business and anybody out there and basically, look, you need to treat IT the same way you treat accounting, the same way you treat legal, the same way you treat, healthcare. You have to have a professional who's going to advise you. And you might be big enough to hire your own lawyer. You might be big enough to hire your own cyber team. Probably you're not, though, right? And if you're a small business, you need to have an MSP, an MSSP, someone who's got your back of your business so you don't get ransomware. Because believe it or not, ransomware is just one of the major problems you're going to be facing out there, right? You could have intellectual property theft. You could have Chinese espionage coming in, doing that kind of stuff. You could have a denial of service attack, which is a different form of ransomware. This is a really complex time that we're living in.
I mean, ransomware is in the media, but there's a ton of ways that your attack surface can actually be impacted, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a very broad thing. I don't think people realize that. Yeah. So you mentioned small companies, right? And that's one of the things that I think we find a lot of problems. Large enterprise companies, they have the money, they have the time, they've developed the policies, the procedures, they're able to do this, right? But when we think about how that flows down, right, to the medium size and then the small size business, you do a lot of work with startup companies, you invest in them. And so, I mean, any thoughts on that? How these smaller companies can actually take meaningful action? Because budget is a problem, right? Like you're a small company, you're trying to get traction in the market, you're worried about sales and marketing and everything else, and anything that's a cost center is really hard to justify. So just thoughts there.
Yeah, there's a lot of different approaches. Of course, with our Tenable time, the large enterprise, we could do things like track how well did one division of one company patch compared to another company or another part of that company,
Sure.
right? And insanely useful KPIs, right? When you go down to like a small business, a restaurant, where all the waiters and waitresses are using the same password to do the credit card transactions, right? That doesn't apply. So we've seen a lot of different things. The Cyber Readiness Institute basically says, patch your stuff, strong passwords, don't use USB, and be aware of phishing, right? Those are the 4 things. If you look at something like the CMMC certification, right? If you're a small business, you do business with the DoD, you have to have different levels of
And that's, I think, going to be super challenging for a lot of small businesses to actually comply with.
It is. But one of the things that I found, this goes back to the policy, but also as an investor, we're in a lot of great companies. We're in Halcyon for ransomware, Automox for patching, One Cosmos for authentication and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of times these small business, every now and then we'll get a chance to pitch them and they'll be like, Ron, which of your companies should I work with? And I'll give them a list of all this stuff. And I'm like, or you can go to Microsoft and simply upgrade from your Office 365 account and get all of that stuff. But here's the issue. If you buy everything from Microsoft, it all works together and it costs 2 to 3 times as much as if you bought Halcyon and you bought Automox. But the difference is you got to do it all together. And a lot of times the small businesses don't have somebody who can piece together the best solution for them. So they're faced with either spending more money with Microsoft or working with a third party to cobble something together that's kind of half of what they need.
Yeah, and I think even if a small business is buying stuff from Microsoft, there's still a challenge in there's a lot of configuration there on the backside, right? It still requires expertise to do that.
Yeah, so we're in a company called BMO that just one click and it's done. And it's really the ability to go from a Microsoft environment, 100% audit with something like a Drata, and say that I've got everything from backup to authentication, but it can be a little pricey. And I've seen sticker shock in some cases, but in other cases, I've seen people get that price. And I'm not selling Microsoft here. Don't get me wrong. This is one of the great problems because, like, if you read the National Cybersecurity Strategy, it doesn't say if small business just spent more money with Microsoft, we'd be a safer nation. That's really what we could be pushing though, and it's interesting. Or you could be saying, or if we spent money with next gen, best of breed, next gen technology, like Halcyon's ransomware detection is better than anything on the market, right? That's a new company. I got to integrate it. Do all the MSSPs in the world know about it yet? Not yet. And that's the issue, right? How do we constantly get this best technology in the hands of small business? We haven't figured that out yet as an industry.
Yeah, it's a really hard nut to crack. So when you talk about investments in what you're doing with these smaller startups in cyber, I'm sure a lot of people are interested. Like, what do you look for in a cyber company? What do you look for when somebody comes and pitches you? I see Cindy off camera giving me a smile there.
So it's interesting. Coming out of the NSA, I thought I knew everything about cyber, right? Doing Dragon, I thought I knew everything. Doing Tenable, I got really good exposure, right? Now as an investor, when we're giving money to people and people are asking us to invest, they're kind of educating us. So we're learning new things every day. There's problems people are solving. It's kind of niche right now. This cyber industry is almost 30 years, but there's so many new problems, and it's so important to solve these problems. It's interesting. In general, we got something called the 5-slide pitch deck, and it's the same thing we want to see, and it's also something we want people, if you're thinking about founding a company, you should be able to answer these 5 questions. What problem do you solve? How do you solve it? Do you have any proof that you can do either of those two things, right? What's your ask? Are you raising money? What are you going to do with that money? And then finally, what does success look like? So a lot of times we get pitches, and sometimes we don't even know, is this a nonprofit or is it a for-profit startup company, right? Or, we'll be on page 10, and there's a list of generals that are advising the company, and no disrespect to generals advising companies, but I'm on slide 10. I don't even know what they're doing. They said the cyber industry is getting big, but I don't know what it is, right? So I want people to be concise about what they do, and it's going to serve everybody, because whether you're walking the RSA floor and you're playing cyber buzzword bingo, or you're reading 20 pitch decks a week, that's something that we do, you want to be concise. You want to get to know, or yes, tell me more, as fast as possible.
Yeah, keep it simple, stupid, right?
Exactly.
KISS principle. Like I think as a CISO, as an operator, that was one of my frustrations too, is I'd actually have vendors come in, and at the end of a 45-minute hour presentation, I was like, I don't know what they do, and I don't know how we would ever implement or use this, right? And so you've wasted your time, but you've wasted my time, which is really valuable. And so the quicker you can get to a value proposition, the better off you are.
And not only that, by the time they got to you when you were CISO there, I always joke that CISOs have layers and layers of defenses against marketing people, right?
We do. My standard response is this a sales call? And if so, I don't take inbound unsolicited sales calls, right? It's really hard. But, at the end of the day, like, you've got to look at technology. You've got to see what's emergent, but it does take up a lot of time. So I think that's a great idea. Well, out of those 5 things, like, what's the hardest that you've seen for people to actually pin down, right? Is it how how they're going to make a profit on it? Is it, what problem they're solving? Like, what's the...
So it's a couple things. A lot of our demo is former intelligence community, former DoD people. And frankly, they might be amazing at reverse engineering Chinese malware, but they could not reverse engineer evaluation or what it means for their CTO if they got acquired tomorrow for $50 million from that. So a lot of times people coming from the military, you don't have this sense of, they start making some I call real money, like life-changing money, generational money, which is great. It's a superpower, right? You can do amazing things with that. And I see a lot of people get a little verklempt maybe, or just, hey, I don't want to talk about it, especially if they still have their compatriots still serving in the military, that kind of thing. So that's one. 2 is, I think the biggest thing is people don't think big enough. I think, look, if you're a first-time founder, you want to get a signal, small exit, great strategy. We definitely advise that. But sometimes, people do have tech that can change the world, but they don't want to compete against Palo Alto. They don't want to compete directly against Microsoft or Google. And sometimes it's a little too subtle when, if you look at some of the big brands that just kind of came out of nowhere, Wiz, Signal, that kind of stuff. I mean, Palo Alto even, right? Like when Palo started, I was like, the world has plenty of firewall companies, and now they're the number one, big firewall company that's out. And of course, there are a lot more than that, but you see what I mean, right?
Yeah, certainly. That makes a ton of sense. So you've referenced back military a couple times. And I think, foundationally, like, we see a lot of stuff coming out of Israel, out of 8200 and other groups in Israel, right? There's a lot of stuff that comes out of U.S. military backgrounds. Well, how did that inform you? How did that, like, kind of from an arc of a career side? And I think, for a lot of people out there, they're wondering, like, what does the military have to offer me? And I think it's a very valuable pathway to kind of a future career that may not necessarily end in you being a general in the military, right? It's some other journey, but it's very influential. I'm just wondering, maybe you could touch on that a little bit.
So the Air Force, and my experience at the NSA, and just obviously supporting DoD and the intelligence community at Tenable and what we're doing now and stuff like that, exposed me to a lot of different things. And it's it's a couple interesting things. First of all, is look, the government's pretty bureaucratic. These are really big organizations, right? We don't even have a budget that's consistent from year to year, right? So if you want to do business with the federal government, that's tough, right? That's tough, and you can do it. There's contracts, there's SIBRs, and the government's done amazing things over the last few years. You got AFWorks, SoftWorks, people who just are trying to work with the startups, Incutel, that kind of stuff. But the second big thing that the government kind of showed me is that the government has got all these superpowers. If you look at like what Cyber Command can do versus what NSA can do versus what the CIA can do versus what the FBI can do, and somebody says I'm doing cyber in each of those, they're sort of like the Justice League. They have different abilities to do different things. They have different. So if you could get exposed to more of those things, you get to see this multi-dimensional, the blind men in the room touching the elephant kind of thing. Cyber is this weird kind of thing. So when you come back to policy and how do you fight ransomware, you get really exposed to a lot of things. But what I really like about military founders, intelligence community founders, is they tend to come up with solutions that work. They might not necessarily know how to market it or communicate it, but typically if we see like an East Coast, there's a lot of military folks on the West Coast, but if typically we see like a military-backed company that's going to pitch us, their tech is going to be like Series A, Series B tech, but their pitch is going to be like seed level. And so it's one of the things we really like because we can help with that. There's a lot of integrity. There's a lot of knowledge of the problem, but not necessarily knowledge of how do you bring that solution to a commercial market.
So we've had a lot of U.S.-based startups, right? But there seems to be this prevalence of Israeli-based startups, right, in the cyber side. It's kind of what they're known for, right? Many in the cyber community, if you're out there, you've seen this. Why do you think that they have that propensity for cyber, where in the U.S., while we have it, we have a much bigger military force, right? We put a lot more investment in there. Like, why isn't that generating a lot more returns from a U.S. cyber side versus an Israeli cyber side? Or do you not see it that way?
So it's interesting. I mean, obviously, there's a great history of Israeli cyber companies. I mean, Checkpoint, Palo Alto. I mean, companies like Microsoft, Tenable has offices over there and that sort of thing. The culture that comes out of Israel. I mean, they're living the fight today.
Sure,
absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Cyber is an integral part of military operations, and it's an integral part of U.S. operations. We don't give it the kind of press that it gets in Israel, and we certainly don't. When you see the commercials on TV and the soldiers running into the smoke, right? There's no cyber equivalent of that, right?
It'd be an interesting commercial, a guy sitting at a desk typing and drinking a Diet Coke,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. But the reality is people live and die by the keyboard, right? There's intelligence collections, you're interdicting stuff, you're getting into fairly classified sort of operations and what part's intelligence, what part military operations. In Israel, you have a smaller, tight-knit community. Everybody goes in the service, everybody understands what they do. Therefore, it's part of how they, for them, business is war just as much as warfare is warfare, right? Yeah. And that's the big difference. I think the prediction here is that, if Ukraine does well, and we have a Ukraine and, it's not part of Russia, you're probably going to see a lot of cyber companies come out of Ukraine because cyber is a major component of that war.
Interesting. So that's really good information. So I want to pivot off there because I think you made an interesting connection that at least I saw in that, when we talk about the cyber investment in the U.S. and the perception that it's not, it's not the guy with the rifle like running in from the sea, like taking the beach, right? I think in corporate America, it's kind of that same thing with cyber, right? It's assumed it's a cost center, and it's not assumed to be part of the business.
Excuse me.
Sorry. Fix it in post.
Yep.
When we look at that and we see how cyber's treated in the enterprise, it's very, very similar, right? And it's almost like the red-haired stepchild. Put them in the back room. We don't want to talk to them. They're technology. And we've seen this transition of trying to get CISOs to become more business leaders. We've also seen a lot of increased regulation, right? Where that regulation is kind of driving change, but I don't think we're actually seeing the rubber meet the road where CISOs are being taken seriously as much as they should. Thoughts on that? Like, do you see that changing? Do you see like regulation being the answer to that? I'm not a fan of regulation, but I don't see another way. Like, what's your thoughts?
So again, we go back to policy, right? There's so many different things this administration is trying to do. The latest one is the Securities Exchange Commission trying to make it a little bit more put some penalties on CISOs for not doing their job, right? Even though a CISO might not have the budget to do their job. So you're kind of caught at this point if you're
Or
a
even the
CISO.
authority.
Right. They might not even have the authority to do this kind of stuff. So then who's at fault, right? Is it the board? Is it the executives in the company? Should the public be aware? And this all goes into the whole social contract we were just talking about of, if you got a company, pick a major company, Slack, Salesforce, Microsoft's a good example. We just had the Cyber Safety Review Board kind of go after them and saying, you don't have a culture of cyber, right? And, it sounds like Microsoft's getting the religion and stuff like that, but we need that at every tech company. And I don't know that we're going to have that with SEC regulation. We could, but it's going to have that impact.
Yeah, foundationally, I don't know that the SEC is really the right organization to do that. I mean, I think the devil's in the details on what they're trying to say, right? If it's, hey, you've got to be forthcoming and honest, and you can't materially misstate things, that's fine. But holding a CISO responsible for the fact that he didn't have budget or he didn't have authority. I mean, we've asked a question of guests before, like who goes to jail first, right?
Well,
is it the CEO or the CISO?
I'll give you another one, right? When the plane crashes, right? We got the FAA investigates it, and people kind of equivalent that to the Cyber Safety Review Board, and it's not bad. But let's look at Scattered Spider and MGM and Caesars, right? So there's a lot of stuff of them breaking in. Last time I counted, there's like 25 other major casinos in Vegas. You telling me Scattered Spider didn't go after them? So what did those other casinos do that kind of brushed off that attack, right? They probably had defense in depth, segmented networks, really good compliance, really good trained people, really good backup procedures, but we don't feature that, right? Instead, what we do is we feature, oh my God, Caesars got to pay the ransomware, MGM got hacked. And we're not sort of pushing the good news as much as we're pushing the bad news. And what I don't want to do is overly punish the bad news people. I want to emphasize what's the right way of doing things. And then again, if we're talking about secure by design and secure corporations, how do we know as a consumer which is which? And that's really what it comes down to.
So we were having a discussion last night at dinner, not you and I, but a couple other people, and we were talking about kind of the recent actions against Tim and the stuff that happened against Joe with Uber. And this question came up of potentially like, do we need something additional for CISOs, almost like a equivalency to professional engineer, the bar. There are other professions that have this professional capacity. Do we need that for CISOs? Do we need a professional CISO society or alignment where you can say there's a typical code of conduct, there's a typical job description, there's typical care of duty and practice that you adhere to? And I would also say a recommendation to hiring for enterprises that CISO gets D&O insurance, they get liability protection, they get indemnification, right? Like all these things. Like, is it time for that? Like, and if so, how do we do it?
The short answer is yes. Like when you look at a corporation and you say, what's my legal structure? I might have a few lawyers. I might have outside counsel, right? What are my accountants? Who's my people doing my financial planning? Well, I'm also probably audited. I have tax auditing and stuff like that. I think cyber and IT and data care is so important. You need the same stuff. Now, it's kind of hard to go from nothing to something.
Sure.
We've seen some progress at the board. We're certifying people on boards for doing cyber risk management, things like Digital Directors Network.
Yep.
Big fan of that. Once we have that, you got to have that professionalization in IT because it's not just cyber, it's the entire IT where we're protecting the data and we're protecting the people doing the data. Not only are we trusting them to take care of our data, we got to have their back. So it's got to be both ways.
Yeah, and I think you called it out again, and I just want to highlight that when you say it's not just cyber, right? Like cyber is really a small part of security, right? Like GRC, not really cyber,
right?
But still security, right? And under the CISO and in the security org, but we lump everything, and it's that the non-informed, non-technical person trying to categorize it. So yeah,
risk is risk. It can be a little bit of security theater, right? Where people are coming up with, oh my God, what if aliens attack New York? We need to have a failover, right? Well, what if there's an earthquake? There could be an earthquake. There could be an outage. There can be a lot of issues. It's definitely something to consider.
And at the end of the day, it's all about risk. That's what we are as risk professionals. Well, Ron, look, I want to really thank you for coming in and having a conversation. This has been really informative. It's always great to get your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Ben, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for everybody watching.
And again, thanks for joining us here. I'm Ben Carr with Halcyon. Have a great day.